Professor Mulla is an associate professor of women's, gender and sexuality studies at Emory University in the US. And she uses anthropological methods to study the intersections of law, medicine and policing. She's the author of 2 brilliant books, The Violence of Care, Rape Victims, Forensic Nurses, and Sexual Assault Interventions in 2014, and the co-author of Bodies in Evidence, Race, Gender and Science in Sexual Assault Adjudication, which one of our audience members just told me was a complete light bulb moment for her when she read that book. And she's absolutely, you know, the lights came on and she thought about things in a very different way. So the talk that Professor Mulla is going to give us this evening traces the way in which the courts in the United States continue to frame Black families through the theories of Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who published a report called The Negro Family, The Case for National Action in 1965. A report whose sociological analysis has been debunked and challenged for decades. And what Professor Mulla will show us this evening is how it stubbornly persists as a kind of a lens that guides within the legal frameworks informing court sentencing in the United States. So welcome, Sameena. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, I think what I was going to say is when I started this work way back decades ago in graduate school, there were very few people who were doing this kind of work. Joanna's book was one of the only things that I could find to read, and a handful of other colleagues were scattered all over the world. And so it feels really like a different moment in a good way to be able to have now dozens and dozens of colleagues at various career stages who are all doing this hard work. So I'm in appreciation. I'm happy to share with you the very first iteration of this work, which is part of a larger project in which I examine racial disparities in sentencing practices, which are a taken for granted feature of the US criminal justice system. And in some ways, it's an extension of my second book. But in other ways, it's quite new territory for me. And part of the reorientation I've been having to this work is that I think my first book is probably the one where I felt the most faith in different kinds of systems of intervention and the possibilities of justice that lay in those systems of intervention. And as I have borne anthropological witness to how court systems and forensic intervention operate year after year after year, I have really shifted into an abolitionist perspective. So one thing that happens when one sits in court in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is where this fieldwork was based, and I don't know if you've followed, it is my courthouse in which one of the circuit court judges was arrested recently for the charge is obstruction of justice for showing an immigrant a side door. So we all have very strong opinions on that, but it's a very lively place. And when you're in this place, in fact, what ended up happening is after 2 to 3 years of observing sexual assault adjudication, I began to hear more and more patterns of discourse that are about Black communities in Milwaukee County. And ostensibly, these patterns are offered in relationship to the person who's being prosecuted, which is somebody that we are collectively trying to hold accountable for sexual harm, right, of another person. But the other thing that is very apparent is that most of these adjudicants are in relation to one another. They are part of the same family, if not that, they're neighbors, or they may go to the same church. They're teachers in a child's school, right? And so more and more, it became very apparent that these theories that are offered up about the adjudicants actually are also about the victim's life world. And so I had come to a point then where I had to make a decision about how comfortable I am with the kind of accretion of deeply racist narratives, right, which are not just about empty discourse, but are in fact about incarceration and not only the deprivation of freedom of the person that you are seeking to hold accountable, but also the exiting of that person and their labor from a community that is increasingly over-incarcerated. So that is where this project sits, kind of in the trajectory of my work. And what I will say is that when one examines racial disparities in sentencing practices, they're almost a taken for granted feature in the US criminal justice system. We scrutinize these dynamics as scholars and activists. We never seem to be shocked to learn that young Black men, especially, are systematically sentenced more harshly than their white counterparts. And when I say that, what I mean is like we have plenty of data that shows us that similarly situated adjudicants, when you toggle the variable of race, there tends to be 6 to 7 years of a longer sentence and more time in prison if the adjudicant is Black and if they are young. And if you even heap into these kinds of matching studies a criminal record onto the side of the white adjudicant, it still isn't going to get that adjudicant a longer sentence. The youthfulness of the people who are also being adjudicated is also something that is really striking when one is in the courts. So in the larger book project, I ask how, when law purports to be race neutral in the US, is Blackness consistently and unduly penalized, right? Of course, our statutes are not written in a way that they say, when you see a Black person in court, this is how you appropriately punish them. We do this in lots of different ways. Specifically, I turn to the spectacle of sexual assault sentencing as a site for the production of a deep anti-Blackness cultivated by the court's mistrust of Black kinship, sexuality, and modes of care. Through a detailed ethnography of sexual assault sentencing hearings that unites many different moments of observation, I show how the sentencing hearing focuses on rehabilitation, which requires the person who's been convicted to produce an account of what's called the pro-social assets that will contribute to their transformation. Zero access to the button. So this is a photo from Jury Appreciation Week in the courthouse, and a peculiarity of the legal system in the US is it's a federal system, and so we actually have different criminal state laws across all 50 states. By and large, criminal court cases are tried in front of juries. Wisconsin requires a unanimous opinion or verdict from the jury. That is not the case in all 50 states. I'd be happy to know. The defendant can also choose to have a bench trial in front of a judge, but if you want to sow doubt, it's easier to have 12 people to try to move than just one. So most of these cases were jury cases. The sentencing, on the other hand, is left solely up to the judge. It is the only part in an adjudication where all of the parties can be present, right? During the actual trial, if there is one, there isn't always a trial, but if there is a trial, all of the witnesses are sequestered. So they're not hearing all of these theories of the story of the case, with the sole exception of the defendant who has the confrontation right within our constitutional culture. So he's typically the only one who sits there and hears all of the different witness testimony. At sentencing, however, it is not uncommon for the families to be present, for the victim survivor to be present. And at this stage, I have many times witnessed people walking out. And it's sometimes difficult to discern why they're walking out, right? Sentencing hearings can be really heady and disturbing. But what is often interesting to me is that some of the most dramatic moments where people leave is actually when the judge is talking, and they're talking about the crime and they're talking about the family. And they're ostensibly, again, talking about the family of the defendant, but that family in many, if not most of the cases, is also the family of the victim survivor, right? We share kin. So this introduced questions for me, and I knew that there was something to really take a look at. Overall, the ethnographic record I rely on includes observations of 687 court appearances, including 34 full jury trials, and 139 sentencing hearings in the Milwaukee County Circuit Court. So that's many more sentencings than trials, and that's because it's much more common for people to plead guilty and take that pathway. Most people don't opt into the process of the trial. These materials are a record of how the court evaluates so-called pro-social assets, often declaring that one's family, friends, employment, education, and community ties fall short. The inevitable conclusion then is that the sentence must be served in custody within a prison, right? This is your only possibility for rehabilitation. I can't return you to your home, to your family, because they're just not going to do the job. And I'll talk about a couple of cases. I do take a lot of care actually not to include details about events of violence. I didn't witness the assaults or the crimes that lead to the scene of the court, but there is something unsettling, I think, in the descriptions of this kind of administrative violence in some ways. So in some of my other work, I have shown how forensic evidence is constituted within the legal process itself, citing anthropologist Pratiksha Bakši's observation that there is no forensic science, for example, outside the law, and the court is the sole arbiter of what becomes the scientific standard of prosecution. And she does this in her 2014 book, The Public Secret of Law, Rape Trials in India. Bakši's claim has further pressed me to think about how the courts craft sentences and produce social science knowledge that informs their decision-making. This talk traces the ways in which courts continue to frame Black families, I'm going to argue, through the theories of Daniel Patrick Moynihan's 1965 report, The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, a report whose sociological analysis has been debunked and challenged for decades. I'm going to show how the report's characterization of the, quote, tangle of pathology of the Black family stubbornly persists as a guiding lens within contemporary legal frameworks, informing court sentences in the United States. So I'll start with an example that I cite frequently, and that is the sentencing of an adjudicant I call Travis Horton, who is 19 years old. And he had ultimately pled guilty to a battery charge. This case did begin as a sexual assault prosecution, but over the course of the life of the case was, quote, pled down to exclude sex offense charges. Now, young Mr. Horton was one of the few people who received a probationary sentence, though he was in custody for 6 days in the county jail. With no criminal record and his charges reduced to misdemeanor pleas, it was still critical for the judge to evaluate the deficiencies in Mr. Horton's support system in a packed courtroom and on the official court record. Invited to address the court, the back and forth began with Mr. Horton apologizing, which isn't uncommon. And he said, "Your Honor, I just would like to say that I'm sorry for what I've done in the past, and I would like to apologize to the victim and her family, and I'm looking forward to doing better." The judge asked Mr. Horton, "Are you working?" "I'm trying. I have to wait until my ID comes." "How can you be almost 19 and not have an ID?" "Because my ID is in Chicago. My birth certificate is in Chicago, and my mom just sent for it." "Where does your mother live?" "She lives in Milwaukee." "So why is your identification in Chicago?" "Because she used to stay in Chicago." "And she didn't bring it up with you? It was too heavy, or what?" "So what are you doing with your time right now, Mr. Horton? Are you basically hanging out?" As the hearing continued, the judge asked Horton why he physically assaulted his girlfriend, who's the victim in this case. When Horton responded that they had gotten into a fight over how to spend Sweetest Day, which is a local holiday in Milwaukee, the judge responded, "This is just another one for the book that I'm going to write." "Mr. Horton, that may be the dumbest, stupidest thing I've ever heard in the last 4 or 5 years. Believe me, that takes in a lot of bad behavior." "So, honey, do you want to go out for a walk in the park and a nice ice cream cone?" "No, I'm not in the mood, okay?" You bang her head on the table. This is another case where this community is so far gone. I've got to leave. I've got to move to Montana or somewhere else. The behavior in this community is so uncivilized, it's unbelievable. And Mr. Horton, I hate to ask, because I'm sure I'm not going to like the answer. Do you have a father in your life? I have a father, but he's not in my life. Where is he? In Chicago. Doing what? Have no idea. And what does your mother do? Does she have a job, or what does she do for a living? She takes care of old people. Are you still living at home? Yes. See, Mr. Horton, if you had a decent father in your life, what your father should have done on finding out about this, he should have kicked your butt from one end of Milwaukee County to the other, and then locked you in the basement. But you don't have a good father, and since your father is not around, your mother should have done the same thing. Kicked your rear end from one side of the county all the way to the other, and then locked you in a basement without a TV, without an Xbox, without cable, without a Game Boy, because you're a bad actor. And when it comes to your graduation, I could get started on this topic. You graduated, if you want to call it that, from Central High School with a 0.8 grade point average on a 4.0 scale, ranking 283rd out of 317 at Central. Central, which has never been confused with Harvard or Stanford, never been confused with even Rufus King or Marquette. So in other words, you graduated because they were sick of seeing you. And they said, see you later, here's your diploma, congratulations. And MPS put out another child in Milwaukee County who can't fend for themselves, can't or doesn't have any employment skills, and will probably be a drain on society. So months later, I'm attending the sentencing of another teenager. This is in a different courtroom with a different judge. And this case has more serious charges attached to it. It began as a human trafficking case involving multiple defendants, all between the ages of 16 and 20. And one of them was tried in juvenile court, while the other 4 were tried in adult court. I'm going to call the person being sentenced, Mr. Anderson. So Mr. Anderson and his friends were initially charged as co-defendants in a set of cases that came to light after one of the defendants uploaded a video of the sexual assault of W to YouTube. And it started to circulate around the school, and it was shown to the school principal, and the principal made a mandated report. So it was a really, really devastating case. Mr. Anderson was labeled as the ringleader of the group. He was a seasoned 17 years old when he was first charged. And so that means that they had the choice of whether to charge him as an adult or they could have charged him in juvenile court. But they decided to charge him in the circuit court. As his trial date approached, the investigators and the prosecutor sought to prove that he was a pimp and a trafficker who had begun his pathway to criminal vice with W, who was 16 years old at the time, as his potential first victim. And they were unable to make the trafficking charges stick. And so after months and months of negotiation, while Anderson was in custody, the plea deal evolved into felony charges of child sexual assault. During his sentencing, the prosecutor commented on how Anderson befriended and used W. She'd get to hang out with these guys, particularly Mr. Anderson, that she thought was really cute, really cool, and he used her for that. It was really not hard at all to convince W that he was her boyfriend. Here, the prosecutor brought Anderson's home life and social world into view, but she also started to fill in particular details about the life of W. As the victim's foster mother describes, the assault has had a huge impact on W. The prosecutor also took issue with the way Anderson characterized his involvement in the case. It is really a mischaracterization for Mr. Anderson to kind of try to portray himself as, oh, he was just kind of a school kid hanging out. I didn't really know. Mr. Anderson is no dummy, and I think he very much understood what was going on, and I see this for him as a crossroads. For the prosecutor, the crossroads in question was whether Anderson would be able to course correct and secure a future without further criminality. So I think that in the community, when Mr. Anderson gets out, Mr. Anderson has an excellent chance of, but he has to make some different decisions than he's been making. He needs not to hang around with guys who are smoking weed and doing nothing and just having casual sex with girls that they can take advantage of and exploit. Then she turned to a discussion of Anderson's mother. I was heartened to see that his mother is different. She says in the pre-sentencing investigation, that she believes her son was wrong and that she shares responsibility. And I think that that is a very positive thing, and he should be listening to his mom. She recognizes here that he had a role and that he is wrong. The evaluation of Anderson's pro-social attributes continued, with the prosecutor noting that he needs, I think, to include some education and vocation. I think that that would go a long way toward taking Mr. Anderson out of situations where boredom and the wrong people are part of the scenario that is making decisions, or that he is making decisions with. She then referenced his marijuana use. It is part of this milieu of hanging out and doing wrong things, doing criminal things, not doing productive things, not acting like an adult. And this is all going to come into play as they painted a picture of an immature Anderson who needed to grow up in the prison and who is beyond the influence of his mother. His own defense attorney would also sort of heap onto these assertions. The opening of the defense attorney's argument addressed the way kids grow up too fast and take sex too lightly. He suggested that Anderson was sexually precocious and that someone with over 20 sexual partners by the age of 17 was inappropriately socialized in his masculinity. It's this machismo thing, trying to present as being a man, presenting as being, somewhat of a tough guy, a man's man. The defense attorney also echoed some of the prosecutor's observations about Anderson's mother. I've had an opportunity to talk to his mom very briefly, and from the quick conversation I had with her, I get from her that she is a strong, independent, working mother. The only thing that I have to work off of with is his moral compass isn't being swayed by her. It's obviously, I think, something being swayed by his outer environment. The gravity of Anderson's single mother, it seems, is not enough to keep him in the orbit of respectable citizen. The defense attorney, therefore, recorded his agreement with the prosecutor. I agree with the assistant district attorney. He does have some growing up to do. He does have to get his priorities in order. The prison sentence is going to sort of be an accelerated course in that growing up. It's going to be an accelerated course in, being, quote, a man. He's going to be with some pretty grisly people there. And hopefully that's going to make him realize these aren't the guys that he wants to be. So maternal and paternal deficits are a recurring theme of sentencing hearings, and they're scaffolded by policy artifacts like the Moynihan report. Rather than arguing that courts are directly referencing Moynihan's report, as they are not, I want to show instead how they mobilize the same categories for deeming Black families unstable. And they also actually mobilize this object called the Black family, because I can promise you, after 600 plus cases, never once is there any idea mobilized about the white family. Okay. So it's something about this as an object of intervention itself that has produced this landscape of theory. So these categories deem Black families unstable and are therefore able to kind of leverage an understanding that they're unsuited for rehabilitation. So published in 1965, while Daniel Patrick Moynihan was an assistant secretary of labor for the administration of Lyndon B. Johnson, the report remains vexingly persistent as a key rhetorical framework used in court to theorize Black family life during sentencing and to present punishment as the inevitable conclusion in light of the failures of Black family life. And I should say punishment in the form of incarceration, because there are many other ways in which we can work with adjudicants to hold them accountable, but primarily the deprivation of their freedom. Given that Moynihan was a key figure in Democratic politics initially, albeit one that went on to serve both Democratic and Republican presidents. So Nixon, he was in Nixon's White House. And then after that, he ran for Senate in New York. So he was just an assistant in the Department of Housing when he wrote this report. His political positioning really resonates for me, in part because Milwaukee County is what we term a sort of like blue dot in a gerrymandered purple state. It is largely Democratic. Most of the judges that we were working with, and the prosecutors, and definitely the defense bar, either very openly or tacitly align themselves with the Democratic Party. We heard plenty of editorializing about their frustrations with the Republican legislature. And so it left me in a position where I really had to contemplate and wrestle with the sort of intensity of the racist rhetoric of liberals, right? And so in the broader scheme of thing, I do think that this is fairly typical, particularly when we're talking about criminal justice and kind of legal interventions, and when we're talking about sexual violence, especially, and how to intervene into it, right? There is this tendency to kind of gravitate towards very harsh criminal justice solutions that we tend to kind of identify with more conservative perspectives, but they're not conservative perspectives. And so I think that that is part of the reason why they reproduce themselves, right? Because most of the people that I observed speaking and talking in this way, I would consider in alignment, right, with liberal or even progressive political positions, right? But not so when it comes to our theories of the Black family. So everything that I've quoted and shared with you thus far from the field research is, spoken aloud by individuals who consider themselves strongly in alignment with liberal politics. It feels critically important to take note of some of the ways in which racism and anti-Blackness in the US are not simply a conservative project. I also want to take note that one of the criticisms that not just myself, but others have been met with, this is very silly, but I wrote this out anyways, is the assertion that the notion that Moynihan's report has shaped policy is challenged because there were merely 100 copies printed of this report in 1965, and there seem to be records that not many of them circulated. However, in 1968, there's a 50-minute discussion on I think it's New York Public Radio with Peachy Brooks, Verda Smart Grosvenor, Florence Kennedy, the attorney, and Eleanor Norton, who later became my congresswoman in Washington, D.C., talking about the role of the Black woman, in which they return again and again to the position that, quote, Moynihan has us all psyched out, they're saying. And they insist that his report is, quote, a hustle. Verda Smart Grosvenor notes that, quote, I think the Moynihan report is just another one of those things, a lace curtain. I can't let him define us. Cataloging the ways in which Moynihan characterizes the pathologies of single Black mothers, the women concur that, quote, some of the things that are considered weaknesses or stereotypes are strengths. In 1970, Seymour Parker and Robert Kleiner wrote an article about what they called, quote, the Moynihan controversy in the journal American Anthropologist. And of course, Moynihan wrote a letter taking exception to their engagement with his theories, which was also published in the journal in 1971. At the report's 50-year anniversary in 2015, the internet is a lovely place. You can find dozens of symposiums, panels, and special issues relitigating what Moynihan got right and what he may have gotten wrong from a range of disciplinary and also political positions. So one of my favorites is the Hoover Foundation, which is a libertarian institute at Stanford, and they invite Lamar Alexander, who was Secretary of Education under George H.W. Bush, to lead this panel, and for 2 hours they're talking about the merits of Moynihan. It's also reprinted in 1989, and that version, in a sort of edited volume, that version has over 6,000 citations. So those fleeting anchors in the archive suggest to me that his ideas were and are in circulation beyond their brief life in original print. And when I am in the courts, I hear these resonances often when the discussion turns to Black family life. So one more thing inflecting the work, which is invoked here with that radio roundtable that I referenced, is that the critique and pushback against Moynihan's theory is immediate. In her 1974 ethnography of a Midwestern community that she calls the Flats, anthropologist Carol Stack, for example, critiqued the report's premises that Black families are unstable and disorganized. Where the courts see poverty-driven instability and households that are not anchored to a nuclear family, Stack echoed Peachy Brooks, Rhoda Smart Grosvenor, Florence Kennedy, and Eleanor Norton, who saw dense and broad networks of kinship and community that created pathways for economic redistribution, labor redistribution, obligation, and caregiving. These densities make their way into the courts, where they're critiqued as superficial demonstrations or pathologies of the family. Despite a contemporaneous ethnographic record that critiqued Moynihan, I argue that the myth of Moynihan persists and that anthropologists have a duty to maintain skepticism about what comes to be called African American kinship. The persistence of Moynihan can be best appreciated by thinking about the language and key construction of the report. It draws on a wide array of social science research to produce an account of what Moynihan notoriously called the tangle of pathology, which Moynihan introduces and repeats to characterize the Black family. The first time I heard that phrase, I think it was Patricia Hill Collins writing about Moynihan. I thought it was her sort of like lyrical take on it, but it's actually the title of chapter 4 and is repeated throughout. What is interesting about the theory he poses is the way he, like many before and after him, is going to continually make claims about causal mechanisms, conflating correlation with causation. So it has that kind of fundamental flaw. And in reading the report, it is also interesting to think about the data that Moynihan chooses to put forward his argument when he draws on information about poverty and employment generally, and when he turns to racially specific data. As many before me have noted, the root cause of this tangle of pathology Moynihan attributes to the enduring impact of chattel slavery, writing that, quote, psychologists point out that slavery in all its forms sharply lowered the need for achievement in slaves because enslaved people were placed in a completely dependent role. He also posited that because slave owners did not foster marriage among the slaves they held, and never, quote, hesitated to separate families on the auction block, the slave household often developed a fatherless, matrifocal, mother-centered pattern. And here he's citing Thomas Pettigrew's work. Within the report, Moynihan posits that Black men were more vulnerable in the period of emancipation during Jim Crow, which is the era of history in which segregation becomes the norm, because men had a public life from the beginning. Moynihan structures his notion of vulnerabilities across gendered lines. Because men navigated public spaces, per Moynihan, quote, of the greater importance, the Negro male, particularly in the South, became an object of intense hostility, an attitude unquestionably based in some measure of fear. The hostility of Jim Crow, quote, unquestionably worked against the emergence of a strong father figure. The very essence of the male animal, from the bantam rooster to the four-star general, is to strut, quote. The ability to strut, Moynihan asserts, was cut short because of the violence of lynching. In this same section, Moynihan builds his case for the primacy of the family by citing Male and Female by the anthropologist Margaret Mead. In every known human society, everywhere in the world, the young male learns that when he grows up, one of the things which he must do in order to be a full member of society is to provide food for some female and her young. He follows Mead's work to show that this pattern can be broken over generations. What replaces these broken patterns? This is where Moynihan turns to the researcher with whom his report is primarily associated, the African-American sociologist E. Franklin Frazier. Moynihan states, E. Franklin Frazier makes clear that at the time of emancipation, Negro women were already, quote, accustomed to playing the dominant role in family and marriage relations, and that this role persisted in the decades of rural life that followed. While Moynihan attributes slavery with the structural force of this, quote, inversion of gender roles, it's curious to me that he allows for something like a normative family structure under the institution. So I think there's actually a historical fallacy in play within the report. Bridging the past to the present, Moynihan then turns to the scourge of urbanism. The shift to city life, quote, is immensely disruptive of traditional social patterns. In cities, Black neighborhoods are like, quote, the wild Irish slums of the 19th century Northeast, drunkenness, crime, corruption, discrimination, family disorganization, juvenile delinquency were the routine of that era. This comparison is very revealing as it juxtaposes 19th century Irish Americans with 20th century African Americans, inviting contemporary readers to think about racialization as we may consider the 19th century in which Irish immigrants to the US had not yet attained the status of whiteness, right? I think it's also really interesting because in some ways in the 1960s, Irish Americans were considered a kind of success story, right? That they started out as this racialized other and were able to walk this path into whiteness. So those stories it's offered by Moynihan as a kind of like a hopeful, if still problematic, comparison. To Moynihan, the great migration of Southern and largely rural Black families to urban centers from the 1920s and 40s hastened the degeneration of Black family life. Quote, Black families will crowd the slum areas of Southern cities or make their way to Northern cities, where their family life will become disrupted and their poverty will force them to depend upon charity. Moynihan continues to draw on E. Franklin Fraser extensively in a section of the report titled In the City of Destruction, agreeing with Fraser that migration to the city led to settling in areas, quote, from which practically all institutional life has disappeared. So think again of Mr. Horton, his itinerary from Chicago to Milwaukee, his lack of access to an identification card, and his lack of access to a robust public education. Disappearing institutional life, Moynihan argued, led to simultaneous loss of, quote, internal cohesion and the controlling force of public opinion and communal institutions. Without these moderating forces, fathers began to leave their families. Family desertion, according to Fraser, was a sign of an unsuccessful, quote, process of adjustment to the urban environment. And it's here where I perked up a bit. I think it's a very disciplinary kind of focus, because I find that at this stage this transition in the report is where we start to hear a language of maladjustment or maladaptivity. So there are echoes here of this kind of like evolutionary theory, and we're plunged into those discourses. Now, Carol Stack, going back to All Our Kin, finds that this is in fact where Moynihan fails to recognize the networks of care which extend between generations and household within the flats, and to note that they are actually highly adaptive. So again, this is a 1974 text based on field research that was conducted in the 1960s, so she's a contemporary of Moynihan's, and I would argue a better researcher. Moynihan also sets out a set of metrics for measuring the degeneration of family life and notes that, quote, in every index of family pathology, divorce, separation, and desertion, female family head, children in broken homes, and illegitimacy, the contrast between the urban and rural environment for Negro families is unmistakable. The geography of the Moynihan report is also one that characterizes urban life through the lens of pathology. Moynihan telescopes between national trends and data from particular cities or neighborhoods, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Harlem. He spends a great deal of time on Harlem, tracking its social disorganization, even as Black feminists such as Leith Mullings generated rich studies on woman-headed households, resilience, stress, and the strength of Harlem's social fabric. Edward White Baki's 1940 study of the effects of unemployment on family structures informs Moynihan's understanding of the impact of unemployment on the family. Moynihan notes that Baki's research is based on white families, but he thinks that these patterns are applicable to Black families too. The first stage of Baki's theory is characterized by exhaustion of credit, followed by the second stage in which the wife enters the labor force. This leads to the father losing his provider status. And then in the third stage, Bakke documents the entry of a social worker into the household and states that there are now two women who are, quote, in charge, the working wife and the caseworker, who he says is an outsider. Now, again, it's not clear or self-evident that the assumption that Black women entered the labor force only after the rise of unemployment is a correct assumption. I think this is something that actually would have to be examined very locally and historically specifically. There are many, many areas in the US where Black women have always worked and labored outside of the household, predating emancipation, in fact. But Moynihan highlights this as a degenerative pattern. He is also concerned that while economic downturns result in downturns of employment of Black men, which are then followed by declines in what he terms family stability, economic upturns, while resulting in increases in employment, do not translate to upturns in family stability, again, measured by two-person headed households, marriage rates, and lower rates of children being born to unmarried parents. He finally explains the pernicious, even contagious nature of the proliferation of single-family households. Even families with income stability and two-parent households do more poorly from an economic perspective when they are in areas in which there are more single-headed households, right? And this is one of the talking points I've heard right-wing groups respond or sort of carry forward. Even very recently, they'll say single-headed households are not good for anybody, right? We all live in the same social fabric. And I think, again, it seems to just be continuing this very sloppy correlational relationship without really thinking through the causal kind of mechanisms, which are much harder to parse out. Moynihan establishes the relationship between income stability and family stability. Higher incomes result in higher family stability. He also interposes this with a language of family morality and stability, equating morality with stability. And here we reach the notorious Tangle of Pathology chapter. Moynihan stresses that this applies only to poor Black families. His comparisons of middle-class Black families to white families portrays a favorable comparison in which the respective Black families actually have lower birth rates, that's how he's counting their success, than the white families of an equivalent income level. Here he's associating large family size as a negative variable. This is also where Moynihan further develops a logic of contagion. It might be estimated that as much as half of the Negro community falls into the middle class. However, the remaining half is in desperate and deteriorating circumstances. Moreover, because of housing segregation, it is immensely difficult for the stable half to escape from the cultural influences of the unstable one. The children of middle-class Negroes often as enough must grow up in or next to the slums, an experience almost unknown to white middle-class children. They are therefore constantly exposed to the pathology of the disturbed group and constantly in danger of being drawn into it. And I think there's more work to be done here around work like Leith Mulling's research on what she calls the sojourner syndrome, or this study that she did on why people don't leave Harlem, even if they have the wealth to do so. And again, it has to do with having one's entire kinship network kind of together and at the ready to take on shared childcare, shared rent, and income. And so she thinks of it as a resilient strategy. Nevertheless, Moynihan insists that, quote, in a word, most Negro youth are in danger of being caught up in the tangled pathology that affects their world, and probably a majority are so entrapped. And this echoes for me the way that Anderson's defense attorney bemoans his resistant, quote, moral compass, which can't be swayed by his strong working mother. The compass is, as I already shared, quote, obviously being swayed by his outer environment. While Moynihan names other variables impacting the social pathology afflicting the Negro community, he insists that, quote, at the center of the tangle of pathology is the weakness of the family structure. Once or twice removed, it will be found to be the principal source of most of the aberrant, inadequate, or antisocial behavior that did not establish but now serves to perpetuate the cycle of poverty and deprivation. It is the invocation of antisociality that strikes me as significant here, as this forms the center of the tripartite structure of sentencing hearings as they weigh the antisocial and prosocial nature of the defendant in relation to their assessments of his capacity for rehabilitation. Being encoded as an antisocial figure is more likely to lead to a sentence of incarceration in which one's attorney casts prison as a place where one can mature, where someone like Anderson can get his priorities in order, or to continue to remind you what the defense attorney said again, the prison sentence is going to sort of be an accelerated course in that growing up. He's going to be with some pretty grisly people there, and hopefully that's going to make him realize these aren't the guys that he wants to be. If Moynihan asserts that it is a fundamental fact that Black American families have, quote, reversed roles of husband and wife, what would he make of the courts claiming for the prison the role of the father? By framing the African American family as a sociological or policy object, Moynihan offers his readers and inheritors a framework that invites theorizing. Again and again, he connects the dynamics of Black families to their racial identities. For example, citing work by Blood Jr. and Wolf on low-income families in Detroit, which finds that men in these families have unusually low power. But he notes that while this is a characteristic of all low-income families, quote, the pattern pervades the Black social structure. He arrives at this conclusion by citing another study of families with dominant wives, where 44% of Black wives are categorized as dominant, while only 20% of white wives are deemed similarly dominant. I haven't got my hands on the study yet. I would love to know what makes a dominant wife. White families in the study are majority egalitarian. Happy to know. While these details permeate the report, the white family, again, never emerges as an object of scrutiny, nor is the family life of white adjudicants discussed as such. It's not white family life, it's this individual's family life. This in itself may be the most enduring feature of Moynihan's legacy. In the courts, judges and attorneys repeatedly evoked the figure of a deficient community that could not care for itself. These courtroom logics mirrored culture of poverty arguments that have long been challenged. Culture of poverty theories explained the persistence of poverty in terms of presumed negative qualities within a culture: family disorganization, group disintegration, personal disorganization, resignation, and fatalism. What emerged in the courts was what Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve has called a ceremony of racial degradation, one with a particular gendered valence and a distinctive anti-Blackness that reproduced its logics by claiming the authority to evaluate and to dispense care in the form of imprisonment. Moynihan asserts many things in his report. For example, that, quote, for vast numbers of the unskilled, poorly educated city working class, the fabric of conventional social relationships has all but disintegrated. The stickiness of this anti-Black logic clung not only to the person being sentenced. The field notes and court transcripts we collected were replete with many more examples of the ways in which sentencing hearings became a trap for all of the people in the social world of the person being convicted. The victims, lovers, wives, partners, girlfriends, mothers, employers, educators, pastors, and many other kin and relations were often the subject of scrutiny, scornfully dismissed or deemed inadequate. The sentencing served as a conduit into the social world of the person being convicted. The fate of the sex offender was then sutured to the future of Black communities with which he was associated, who were themselves disciplined through the sentencing hearing. This is how the state sent its tendrils deeply into the very fabric of Milwaukee's Black social worlds, expanding its carceral reach and institutionalizing the condemnation of Blackness that is fundamental to racial orders that uphold urban life. During her fieldwork in the 1960s, Carol Stack became, this is a quote, poignantly aware of the alliances of individuals trading and exchanging goods, resources, and the care of children, the intensity of their domestic cooperation, and the exchange of goods and services among those persons, both kin and non-kin. Stack's description of caregiving resembles queer families like those discussed in Tiffany Latabo King's Black Feminisms and Pessimism, Abolishing Moynihan's Negro Family, in which she notes that, quote, alongside the sociologist's attempt to police and surveil unruly Black urban life through producing the Black family as an object of knowledge and problem for national security, Moynihan also reaffirmed the family as a singular epistemic mode of knowing and regulating the self and American or U.S. civil society. Through her readings of Kay Lindsay's The Black Woman as Woman and Hortense Spiller's Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, she interrogates the naturalization of the family while gesturing towards the fugitivity of family life, which she sort of excavates in key literary texts, namely Sapphire's Push and Cydia Hartman's Lose Your Mother. And scholars like Joy James have set forward notions of captive maternity that offer challenging accounts of maternal possibility Scholars like Joy James have set forward notions of captive maternity that offer challenging accounts of maternal possibility that are located within different genealogies of Black kinship. And captive maternity is her way of thinking about what maternal relations may have been like under chattel slavery and what they're like with the prison as a key institutional kind of barrier between kin in the contemporary era. So frameworks like these reject the kind of naturalization of the idea of the Black family. There is also a care with which Leaf-Mellings, who I've referenced several times, avoids citing or engaging the Moynihan report or Moynihan's constructs of Black family work in her life in her work, and the consistency of her lifelong emphasis on structures. Even as Moynihan's framings haunt the practices of sentencing to which I bore witness, Black feminists have offered varying insights into Black socialities and have made claims challenging Moynihan's overdetermined interpretation of social science research pertaining to the emergence of the Black family. Understanding the knowledge-making pathways of the courts, whereby they resist alternative theories in favor of those which have been trotted out again and again in the name of precedent, helps us understand why something like a policy document can become an artifact in the production of legal knowledge. This is paired with the continued insistence on the efficacy of prison as a solution to deal with all forms of violent behavior and encounters. So in one more case, State versus Milton, the court constructed a prison sentence for this particular defendant. And everyone who was present that day, this was an older adult defendant, concurred that this was, quote, a prison case because Mr. Milton had previously been convicted for sexual assault, and he'd been recently released, so he definitely should have known better, the prosecutor said. One of their main concerns was that the sentence was long enough that he would be able to complete a sex offender treatment program while in custody. His attorney said, I think that would be enough punishment and time on extended supervision for him to get treatment. Curiously, however, during his previous sentence, the court had ordered sex offender treatment, but all present noted that in his pre-sentencing investigation, it stated that he was released from prison without the benefit of sex offender treatment. It appears that it wasn't ordered for whatever reason, or the Department of Corrections didn't have a program available for him. And I make these notes because this kind of continual fictionalizing of the rehabilitative capacity of the American prison system is continuously evoked in this space as well, right? So if the prison is your daddy, he's the daddy of your dreams and not, in fact, the daddy that we actually want to see do the work. So this time, they hoped that it would be different for Mr. Milton and that he would get his therapy. As for Anderson, who court officers hoped would mature while serving his sentence, it's hard to know from administrative records what kind of man the prison made Anderson. And I can now look up his records and I can see that after he was released, he had 2 additional harassment orders on his record. And those details tend to be sealed to protect the identity, as they should, of the person who asked for the restraining order. So I don't have a lot of insight into what that was about. There are also 2 additional dismissed felony charges for possession of a weapon, which is also ambivalent because as a felon, you can't, I know we're wild in the US, you can't own a weapon. And so that in itself becomes a crime. It's the felon in possession of a weapon that makes for a crime, but those charges are dismissed. And then there's also this year a child paternity case on the books for him. So what is at stake here? There is a way to read this set of developments in Anderson's own life, right? He continues to have this administrative life in this reporting system in Wisconsin. And I didn't check any other jurisdictions, so it is possible that there are other cases out there. But I want to kind of turn away from the sense of whether this is like a failure or a success, and ask instead, like how it is that the image of Anderson's mother as a matriarch was mobilized to cast their family as deviant because it was not headed by a patriarch, where the absence of this patriarch was then used as evidence of anti-sociality and Black cultural inferiority. To sentence by the time the case finished, 18-year-old to 7 years in prison, which was a very long prison sentence, and an additional 6 years of what we call extended supervision. Wisconsin is what we call a truth in sentencing state, so there are no probation or early release hearings. You're given a structured sentence when you are sentenced, and so you know how many years you are going to be in the prison and how many years you are going to be, quote, on paper, checking in with your corrections officer to serve the rest of your sentence out of custody. So, but if we cite Patricia Hill Collins, we can see again how this anti-sociality is mobilized as evidence of Black cultural inferiority. And she's also noted that the controlling image of the Jezebel is a sexually promiscuous figure who's been key to sustaining systems of racial class and gender oppression, and that both the reality and threat of violence have acted as a form of social control for African American women. And I draw on that in order to say that there is something also about the fact that this felony court, right, in which we are gathered to address sexual harm, right, which is something that we all rightfully have very strong feelings about, I think is another extension of thinking about how we use sexuality as a realm of domination, right? And I end with this observation to suggest that the spectacle of sexual assault prosecution also acts as a form of social control of African American women whose choices, orientations to maternal care, and social roles are picked apart, even as the courts make claims that they're protecting the interests of Black women and girls. Thank you.